The racist officer didn't know that by humiliating the black doctor, he was putting his own life at risk. But when the doctor becomes his last hope for survival, what will he decide? Watch this video till the end to find out how this dramatic story concludes. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. The city was still waking up from the late-night silence, the faint hum of cars passing by barely audible through the thick walls of the hospital. Dr. Jonathan Wilson stood in front of a mirror in the staff restroom, wiping the sweat from his brow. His eyes, tired but focused, reflected the intensity of the 12-hour shift he had just finished. It had been a grueling night in the operating room. A life hung in the balance, but Jonathan had managed to pull his patient back from the brink of death. This was the part of his work that both drained and fulfilled him. A successful surgeon, Jonathan had saved countless lives, but every shift left its mark. Tonight was no different. He slowly removed his surgical mask, glancing down at his hands, still shaking slightly from the adrenaline that had surged through his veins during the critical hours of the operation. His mind drifted to thoughts of home, where a warm bed and much-needed rest awaited. The exhaustion weighed on him, but the satisfaction of having saved yet another life gave him a sense of purpose that no fatigue could overcome. It was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen this path, despite the long hours, the stress, and the constant pressure. Jonathan had worked hard to get to where he was, a chief surgeon at one of the most prestigious hospitals in the city. His skills had earned him respect from colleagues, patients, and staff alike. However, there was a part of his life that never fully allowed him to bask in his achievements. Being a black man, even a successful one, meant that society often looked at him differently. He felt it in subtle ways, moments when he had to prove his competence twice as much, moments when his authority was questioned, moments when patients hesitated just a little too long before trusting his expertise. These experiences had been with him his whole life, but they had only intensified since he had achieved success in his field. Jonathan splashed cold water on his face, trying to shake off the heaviness in his chest. He wasn't one to dwell on these thoughts for too long. He had built a life based on hard work and integrity, and no matter how much the world wanted to see him as something less, he refused to let it dictate his identity. After changing out of his scrubs, Jonathan made his way to the hospital parking lot. The air was crisp, and the sky was a soft shade of blue as the sun began to rise. He checked his phone briefly. No missed calls, no urgent messages. It seemed like the world, at least for now, was at peace. He was ready to drive home, to collapse into his bed and let his mind drift into the bliss of sleep. Sliding into the driver's seat of his sleek black sedan, Jonathan exhaled deeply. He turned the key in the ignition, and the soft purr of the engine filled the car. The sound was almost meditative, a soothing reminder that soon he would be home. He adjusted the rearview mirror, glanced at the empty parking lot behind him, and slowly pulled out onto the quiet city streets. The roads were still mostly empty at this early hour. Jonathan's mind began to wander as he drove through familiar neighborhoods, thinking about the patients he had treated that night, the choices he had made, and the delicate balance between life and death that always hung over him. Despite the weight of his profession, Jonathan felt at peace. The hospital was where he belonged, where he could use his skills to make a difference. As the car moved through the city, his thoughts shifted to the news stories he had been following recently. Stories of racial tensions, police brutality, and the ongoing fight for justice. These weren't just stories to Jonathan, they were a part of his reality. He had always been aware of the ways in which his race shaped the way others saw him, but the events of recent years had made it impossible to ignore the fact that his success didn't make him immune to prejudice. Even in a white coat, he wasn't invisible to the racism that still lingered in society. Lost in thought, Jonathan barely noticed the police car that had been trailing him for several blocks. It wasn't until he caught a glimpse of flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror that his heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to pull over, even though he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. Maybe the officer was just passing by, heading to another call. Maybe this wasn't about him. But the police car remained behind him, its lights flashing insistently. Jonathan felt his chest tighten as the familiar wave of anxiety washed over him. He glanced at the dashboard. His speed was well within the limit. His car was in perfect condition. There was no reason for him to be stopped. Yet he knew all too well that it wasn't always about reason. With a sigh, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road. The street was quiet, no cars in sight. The officer's car pulled up behind him, and Jonathan felt the tension rise in his body. He placed both hands on the steering wheel, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He had seen this situation play out too many times. Innocent black men pulled over, questioned, harassed. He had always hoped it wouldn't happen to him, but deep down, he knew that his success didn't shield him from the reality of being a black man in America. The officer took his time getting out of the car, and Jonathan watched in the rearview mirror as he approached, his hand resting on his holster. The sight sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had done nothing wrong. He just needed to get through this. "License and registration," the officer said as he approached the driver's side window, his tone cold and detached. Jonathan reached for the glove compartment, moving slowly and deliberately, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Sure thing, officer," he replied, keeping his voice calm and polite. He retrieved his license and registration and handed them over. The officer barely glanced at the documents before turning his attention back to Jonathan. "Where are you headed?" "Home," Jonathan said. "I just finished a shift at the hospital." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You a doctor?" "Yes," Jonathan replied, trying not to let the skepticism in the officer's voice get to him. "I'm a surgeon at St. Mary's." The officer said nothing for a moment, just stared at Jonathan as if sizing him up. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "You're driving a pretty nice car for a doctor," the officer finally said, his tone dripping with suspicion. Jonathan's heart sank. He had heard this before. The unspoken implication that a black man couldn't possibly afford a car like his unless he was involved in something illegal. He fought to keep his composure, reminding himself that he hadn't done anything wrong. But the officer's tone, his posture, the way his hand lingered near his gun, it all made Jonathan feel like he was already guilty in the officer's eyes. "I worked hard for this car," Jonathan said, his voice steady, though inside his nerves were fraying. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Step out of the vehicle." Jonathan blinked, the tension in his body escalating. "Officer, is there a problem?" "Step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand now resting fully on the butt of his gun. Jonathan's pulse quickened. This was not how he had imagined his morning would go. He had just saved a life a few hours ago, and now he was being treated like a criminal for simply driving home. But he knew better than to argue. Arguing could make things worse. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door, stepping out into the cool morning air. He kept his hands visible, resisting the urge to clench them into fists. The officer's eyes followed his every movement, watching him like a predator sizing up its prey. The street was still empty, the silence oppressive. Jonathan felt exposed, vulnerable. He had faced high-stress situations in the operating room, but this was different. This was a kind of helplessness he hadn't felt in a long time. "Turn around and place your hands on the car," the officer ordered. Jonathan hesitated, his heart pounding. "What's going on? Why are you—" "Do it," the officer barked, his voice sharp and threatening. Jonathan slowly turned, placing his hands on the roof of his car, the cold metal biting into his palms. He could hear the officer moving behind him, felt the tension in the air. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was something more, something darker. As the officer roughly patted him down, Jonathan's mind raced. What had he done to deserve this? Why was this happening to him? He was a doctor, a man who saved lives, but to this officer he was just another black man who didn't belong behind the wheel of a nice car. And in that moment, Jonathan realized that no matter how successful he became, no matter how many lives he saved, there would always be people who saw him as less than human. The cool morning air pressed against Jonathan's skin as he stood with his hands flat against the roof of his car. His breathing was steady, though inside he could feel the panic starting to rise. He had been in difficult situations before, life and death moments in the operating room where every decision could mean the difference between saving a life or losing one, but none of that could prepare him for the sheer helplessness he felt now. This wasn't a battle of skill or knowledge. This was a situation where his competence, his identity, none of it mattered. To the officer behind him, he was just another threat to be neutralized. Jonathan could hear the officer moving behind him, the shuffle of his boots on the pavement, the jingle of keys and cuffs. The officer's presence was heavy with unspoken authority, a power that Jonathan knew he couldn't challenge without risking everything. The officer, now thoroughly convinced that Jonathan was hiding something, began frisking him, his hands moving over Jonathan's body with unnecessary force. Every touch was an accusation, a reminder that to this man, Jonathan wasn't a respected surgeon, wasn't someone who had spent his life helping others. He was simply another black man who had to be brought under control. Jonathan clenched his teeth, the frustration bubbling inside him. He wanted to say something, wanted to ask why this was happening, but he knew better. He had seen too many stories of black men being harassed, or worse, for daring to question the authority of an officer. His only option now was to comply, to wait for this nightmare to end. "What's in the car?" the officer asked, his voice low and menacing. Jonathan swallowed, his voice coming out more strained than he intended. "Just my things, medical equipment, clothes, nothing illegal." The officer grunted, not convinced. "You got papers for this car? Where'd you steal it?" Jonathan's pulse quickened. The insinuation wasn't just offensive, it was deeply infuriating. He had worked hard for everything he had, and now he was being treated like a criminal simply because he didn't fit the image this officer had in his mind of a legitimate car owner. "It's my car," Jonathan said, his voice as calm as he could manage. "I've got the registration and everything in the glove compartment. You can check." The officer paused for a moment, then moved around the car, keeping his eyes on Jonathan the entire time, as if expecting him to make a sudden move. He opened the passenger side door and rummaged through the glove compartment, pulling out the papers Jonathan had mentioned. There was a long, tense silence as the officer looked through the documents, but instead of easing the situation, his suspicion only seemed to grow. "This looks a little too clean," the officer muttered, almost to himself, but loud enough for Jonathan to hear. Doctors don't drive cars like this unless they're involved in something they shouldn't be. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream, wanted to tell this man exactly how wrong he was, but he held back. The years of quiet resilience, the countless moments of biting his tongue when faced with subtle racism were all boiling to the surface now, but he knew this was not the time to unleash it. "Officer," Jonathan began, trying to keep his tone steady, "I'm not involved in anything illegal. I just finished a 12-hour shift at the hospital. I'm a surgeon. I save lives." The officer's eyes flicked up from the papers, his expression hard. "A surgeon, huh?" Jonathan nodded, relief seeping in for a brief moment, thinking that maybe the officer would realize his mistake and back down. But the look on the officer's face remained cold and skeptical. "Yeah, sure," the officer said, his voice dripping with condescension. "A surgeon driving a car like this. You expect me to believe that?" Jonathan's frustration grew. "Why wouldn't you? I worked hard for this car. I worked hard for everything I have." The officer stepped closer, his posture aggressive. "I've seen plenty of people like you thinking they're above the law just because they got a fancy job or drive a nice car. But that doesn't mean you're not hiding something." The insinuation hit Jonathan like a punch to the gut. It didn't matter what he said, didn't matter how much evidence he had that he was who he said he was. In this officer's eyes, he would always be guilty of something. His accomplishments, his education, his work, they meant nothing. "Look," Jonathan said, trying to hold on to the last shreds of his patience, "I've got nothing to hide. You've seen the papers, you've frisked me, there's nothing here. I just want to go home." But the officer wasn't done. His eyes narrowed, and he took another step closer to Jonathan, his hand still hovering near his holster. "You don't get to decide when you go home," he said, his voice a low growl. "I do." Jonathan felt his heart drop. This wasn't about checking papers or making sure everything was in order. This was about power. The officer wasn't just suspicious. He was angry. Angry that someone like Jonathan existed. Someone who defied the narrative this man had built in his mind about black men in nice cars. And now he was asserting his dominance, making it clear that in this moment, Jonathan's fate rested entirely in his hands. The officer took the papers and threw them back into the car, his eyes never leaving Jonathan. "Turn around," he ordered, his voice cold. Jonathan's heart raced. "Officer, please!" "Turn around," the officer barked, his hand gripping the butt of his gun now. Jonathan had no choice. Slowly, he turned, placing his hands back on the roof of the car, his body rigid with tension. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, could feel the weight of the power imbalance between them. He was at the mercy of this man, and there was nothing he could do to change that. "Spread your legs," the officer said, his voice gruff. Jonathan complied, his mind reeling. He was a doctor. He had spent his entire life working to get where he was, to earn respect and recognition. But none of that mattered now. All that mattered was the color of his skin and the car he was driving. The officer began patting him down again, this time rougher, his hands moving with unnecessary force. Jonathan flinched as the officer shoved him, pushing him harder against the car. His breathing quickened, panic rising in his chest. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. This was something far more dangerous. "Where'd you say you work again?" the officer asked, his voice mocking. "St. Mary's," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "I'm a surgeon." "Right," the officer said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "A surgeon. "You sure you didn't steal that white coat, too?" Jonathan bit his lip, the anger inside him reaching its breaking point. He wanted to shout, to demand that this man treat him with the respect he deserved, but he knew it would only make things worse. He was already being treated like a criminal for no reason. If he raised his voice, it could escalate into something far more dangerous. The officer finally stepped back, but the tension between them was still thick. He looked Jonathan up and down one more time as if searching for a reason to arrest him. "Get in the car," the officer said, his voice cold and authoritative. "I'm not done with you yet." Jonathan turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and opened the driver's side door. His hands were trembling as he sat back in the car, the officer's eyes still fixed on him through the window. He could feel the weight of the officer's suspicion, the heavy judgment that had already been cast. For a few long moments, neither of them said anything. The silence was suffocating, the threat of violence hanging in the air. The officer leaned in, his face close to the open window. "You think just because you've got a nice car and some fancy degree you're untouchable?" he sneered. "I've seen guys like you before. You think you're better than everyone else, but you're not." Jonathan didn't respond. His mind was racing, trying to figure out how to de-escalate the situation without making it worse. He felt trapped, cornered by a man who had already made up his mind about him. "You might be a big shot at your little hospital," the officer continued, his voice full of contempt. "But out here, you're nothing." The words cut deep. Jonathan had heard things like this before, but never with such venom. He could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Reacting now would only play into the officer's hands. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," Jonathan said quietly, his voice steady but strained. "I just want to go home." The officer stared at him for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Jonathan sitting in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. Jonathan watched in the rearview mirror as the officer sat in his car, writing something on a clipboard. The tension in his chest didn't ease. He didn't know what would happen next, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. After what felt like an eternity, the officer finally got out of his car and approached Jonathan again. He leaned down to the window, his expression still cold. "You're free to go," he said, his tone flat, as if dismissing Jonathan from a trivial inconvenience. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the relief mixed with lingering anger. He reached for his keys, his hands still shaking as he started the engine. But just as he was about to drive away, the officer's voice stopped him. "Don't think this is over," the officer said, his voice low and threatening. "I'll be keeping an eye on you." Jonathan didn't respond. He didn't have the energy for it. All he wanted now was to get away, to escape the suffocating tension of this encounter. He put the car in drive and pulled away, the officer's cold eyes following him in the rearview mirror until he turned the corner. As the city streets opened up in front of him, Jonathan's mind was still reeling from the encounter. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than he had expected. No matter how much he tried to ignore it, the reality of being a black man in America had just slapped him in the face again. And he knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be the last time. Jonathan drove through the now brightening streets of the city, his hands still gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. The officer's words, his aggression, still echoed in Jonathan's mind. Every part of his body was tense, the adrenaline from the confrontation refusing to subside. His heart raced, not because of what had happened, but because he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see the police car tailing him again. He knew the officer was still somewhere back there, lurking, watching. Jonathan tried to steady his breath, to calm the whirlwind of thoughts spinning in his mind, but the anxiety gripped him hard. This wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong. This was about his entire existence being called into question. As he drove, his mind wandered back to the events of the past few minutes. No matter how composed and calm he had tried to be, none of it had mattered. The officer had already made up his mind about him the second he saw Jonathan's face, his car, his skin. Jonathan had spent years building a life where he could be judged by his actions, his skills, and his dedication. And yet, here he was, reduced to nothing but a stereotype in the eyes of one man with a badge. Jonathan let out a heavy sigh, trying to push the anger down. He had faced racism before, in subtle glances, in offhanded comments, in the assumptions that people made about his abilities. But this was different. This was raw, unfiltered hatred, and it had been directed right at him without hesitation. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at it briefly, seeing a message from his colleague, Dr. Alan Morris, asking about a post-operative case they had worked on together. Jonathan knew he should respond, knew he needed to get his mind back into the realm of medicine and professionalism, but he couldn't bring himself to reach for the phone just yet. He needed space, time to process what had just happened. As he turned onto a quieter street, closer to his neighborhood, a flood of relief washed over him. Home was near, and with it, the promise of rest and temporary escape. But that sense of security was short-lived. Just as he started to feel the tension easing from his shoulders, the unmistakable red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror again. Jonathan's heart dropped. No, not again. He pulled over, his breath catching in his throat. The same car, the same officer. Jonathan watched in disbelief as the officer slowly got out of the car and walked toward him, the weight of his authority heavy in the air. This time, there was no doubt in Jonathan's mind. This wasn't just a routine check. This was harassment. Jonathan took a deep breath and rolled down his window as the officer approached. "Step out of the car," the officer ordered coldly, without any greeting or explanation. Jonathan's pulse quickened. "Officer, I don't understand what this is about. You've already checked my license and registration. Step out of the car." The officer's voice was sharp, each word more threatening than the last. Jonathan felt a surge of panic, but he knew better than to argue. Slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out onto the sidewalk. His mind raced as the officer moved toward him, his hand once again resting on his holster. "What is this about?" Jonathan asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though fear was clawing at his insides. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer stepped closer, his presence looming. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. Dark skin, expensive car, suspicious behavior." Jonathan's stomach dropped. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Are you serious? You just stopped me 5 minutes ago. You know I'm not involved in anything." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes were filled with the same cold suspicion as before, but now there was something more dangerous there. The power dynamics had shifted completely, and Jonathan knew he was caught in a game he couldn't win. The officer reached out and roughly grabbed Jonathan by the arm, twisting it behind his back. Jonathan winced at the sudden pain, instinctively trying to pull away, but the officer's grip tightened. "Hey, what are you doing?" Jonathan shouted, his voice rising as panic set in. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer shoved Jonathan against the side of the car, pinning him there with his knee pressed painfully into his back. Jonathan's mind raced. He could barely breathe, his chest crushed against the cold metal of the car. This was it. He had seen this play out in countless news stories, but never imagined it would happen to him. The officer reached for his radio, speaking into it with an air of cold indifference. "I've got a suspect. Bringing him in." Jonathan's heart pounded in his ears. "Suspect? For what? I haven't done anything." His voice cracked with desperation. The officer yanked Jonathan upright by the cuffs, forcing him to stand. The pain shot through his wrists as the cuffs dug into his skin, but that was nothing compared to the humiliation. The people passing by on the street were staring, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Some pulled out their phones, recording the scene, but no one stepped in. No one asked what was happening. They just watched. Jonathan tried to catch his breath, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. "You've got this all wrong. I'm a doctor. I'm a surgeon at St. Mary's," he shouted, but the officer barely reacted. "You think that matters to me?" the officer sneered. "Doctors don't get a free pass, especially not ones like you." Jonathan's blood boiled. Ones like you? There it was again, that thinly veiled racism. He was nothing to this man. His profession, his success, his identity, they meant nothing. The officer shoved him toward the patrol car, opening the back door and pushing him inside. Jonathan stumbled, his balance thrown off by the tight cuffs and the rough treatment. The door slammed shut behind him, trapping him in the back seat of the police car, the bars on the window a painful reminder of his powerlessness. Jonathan's breath came in ragged gasps as he sat there, staring out at the world through the cage of the police car. His mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened, trying to make sense of the nightmare that had unfolded in a matter of minutes. How could this be happening? How had it escalated so quickly? He leaned forward, his hands still cuffed behind his back, and rested his forehead against the cool metal of the divider between him and the front seat. His mind was spinning, replaying the officer's words over and over. "Ones like you." Those 3 words felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he achieved, he would always be seen as less than. His entire life, he had fought to be recognized for his skills, his intelligence, his humanity. And now, all of that had been stripped away in an instant. Jonathan squeezed his eyes shut, trying to hold back the rising tide of emotion. He was a doctor. He was a healer. He saved lives every day. But now, he was the one who needed saving. The minutes dragged on, the silence in the car unbearable. Jonathan's mind raced, trying to figure out what would happen next. Would they take him to the station? Would they charge him with something? His heart pounded in his chest as the fear and helplessness overwhelmed him. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the officer opened the door and grabbed Jonathan by the arm, pulling him roughly out of the car. Jonathan stumbled, nearly falling to the ground as the officer yanked him to his feet. "You're lucky," the officer said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I've got more important things to deal with today." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the officer reached for the cuffs and unlocked them, the metal biting into his skin as they were removed. He stood there, stunned, rubbing his sore wrists as the officer shoved the cuffs back into his belt. "Get out of here," the officer barked, "and don't think this is over. I'll be watching you." Jonathan didn't move for a moment, his mind still reeling from the events of the last few minutes. The officer had humiliated him, thrown him to the ground, and treated him like a criminal, and now he was just letting him go. He wanted to say something, wanted to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, his chest heavy with emotion. He had no power here, no control, and the officer knew it. Without another word, Jonathan turned and walked back to his car, his legs trembling beneath him. He could feel the eyes of the officer on his back, could feel the weight of the injustice pressing down on him. As he got into his car and closed the door, he let out a shaky breath. His hands were still trembling, his mind still racing. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been treated like nothing, like he was invisible, worthless, and there was nothing he could do about it. Jonathan started the car, the engine humming to life, but he didn't pull away immediately. He sat there for a long moment, staring at his hands on the steering wheel, the weight of the encounter crushing him. This wasn't just about a traffic stop, this was about something much deeper, something that ran through the very fabric of the society he lived in. No matter how much he achieved, no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people who saw him as less than human. People who would reduce him to nothing more than a threat, simply because of the color of his skin. Jonathan closed his eyes, the exhaustion from the night shift mixing with the emotional toll of the morning. He had been through a lot in his life, but this was different. This was personal. And as he finally pulled away from the curb and drove toward home, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. The hospital was bustling with the usual morning activity when Jonathan arrived for his next shift. Nurses hurried down the hallways, doctors discussed cases in low, urgent voices, and the hum of medical equipment provided a steady backdrop to the orchestrated chaos. It was a place Jonathan had always found solace in, a place where his skills, knowledge, and calm under pressure were valued and respected. But today, everything felt different. The weight of what had happened with Officer Ransom was still heavy on his chest, like a bruise that refused to heal. He had spent the last few days trying to put the incident behind him, but no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many surgeries he performed, he couldn't shake the lingering sense of injustice. The anger simmered beneath the surface, and every time he closed his eyes he could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists, the officer's knee pressed against his back. Jonathan walked down the corridor toward the staff locker room, his mind replaying the event over and over. How could something so wrong have happened so quickly? How could he, a man who had dedicated his life to saving others, have been treated like a criminal with such ease? He took a deep breath, trying to center himself. This was not the time to dwell on it. He had patients who needed him. Lives depended on his focus. But no matter how hard he tried, the incident kept creeping into his thoughts, interrupting his concentration. As he opened the door to the locker room, he was greeted by the familiar scent of antiseptic and clean linens. The sterile environment was usually calming to him, but today it only reminded him of how fragile his sense of control had become. His colleague, Dr. Alan Morris, was already there, changing into his scrubs. Alan was one of the few people Jonathan trusted in the hospital, someone who had always treated him with respect and camaraderie. They had worked together on many difficult cases, and there was an unspoken bond between them, built on mutual trust and understanding. "Morning," Alan said, glancing up from his locker. "You good for today? We've got a tough one coming in. Young guy, motorcycle accident, looks like internal bleeding. We're up in 30. Jonathan nodded, forcing himself to focus. "Yeah, I'm good," he replied, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't good. He hadn't been good for days, but this was his job. This was where he belonged, and he couldn't let what had happened interfere with that. Alan studied him for a moment, his brow furrowing. "You sure? You seem off." Jonathan hesitated, considering whether to tell Alan what had happened, but something held him back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the fear of being seen as vulnerable. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion of explaining something that felt so deeply personal. "I'm fine," Jonathan said, turning to his locker and quickly changing into his scrubs. "Just a long night." Alan didn't press the issue, but Jonathan could feel his colleague's concern lingering in the air. They had been through enough together for Alan to know when something was wrong, but Jonathan wasn't ready to talk about it yet. Not here. Not now. They headed toward the operating room, the sound of the hospital's controlled chaos enveloping them. Jonathan tried to shake off the heaviness in his chest, focusing instead on the task ahead. Surgery had always been his escape, the place where everything else faded away and all that mattered was the life in front of him. He needed that now more than ever. As they prepped for surgery, Jonathan's hands moved with practiced precision, but his mind was still clouded by the events of the past few days. He kept reminding himself to stay focused, to keep his emotions in check. But it was harder than it had ever been before. Every time he looked at the sterile tools on the tray, he saw the handcuffs. Every time he heard the monitors beeping, he remembered the sound of the officer's voice, cold and unfeeling. The surgery began, and Jonathan slipped into the rhythm of the procedure, his hands steady as he worked to stop the internal bleeding and repair the damage caused by the accident. His mind focused on the task at hand, pushing everything else aside, but no matter how much he tried, the tension in his body never fully released. It was there, in the back of his mind, a constant reminder of the fragility of his place in the world. Hours passed, and the surgery finally came to an end. Jonathan removed his gloves, feeling the familiar exhaustion that always followed a long procedure. But today, the exhaustion was deeper, more emotional than physical. As they exited the operating room, Alan clapped Jonathan on the shoulder. "Nice work, man. You pulled him back from the edge." Jonathan nodded, but the usual sense of accomplishment wasn't there. He forced a small smile. "Thanks." Alan hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Look, I don't know what's going on with you, but if you need to talk—" Jonathan shook his head, cutting him off gently. "I appreciate it, Alan. I do. But I just need some time. I'll be fine." Alan looked like he wanted to say more, but he respected Jonathan's space and didn't push further. He gave a nod, then headed down the hallway, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts. Jonathan leaned against the wall outside the operating room, his head resting against the cool surface. He had just saved a life, but the sense of fulfillment that usually came with it was missing. All he could feel was the crushing weight of what had happened with Officer Ransom, the humiliation, the anger, the helplessness. And then, as if the universe wasn't done testing him, a nurse rushed down the hallway toward him, her face pale with urgency. "Dr. Wilson," she called out, her voice tight with tension. "We have an emergency. Gunshot victim coming in. Critical condition, you're needed in the ER now." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat, the adrenaline surging back to life. He pushed off the wall and followed the nurse down the hallway, his mind already switching into crisis mode. Whatever had happened earlier didn't matter right now. A life was at stake, and that was all that counted. As they approached the ER, Jonathan could hear the commotion before he even entered the room. Nurses and doctors were already moving around the trauma bay, preparing for the arrival of the patient. "What's the situation?" Jonathan asked, pulling on gloves and preparing himself mentally for whatever lay ahead. "Gunshot wound to the chest," the nurse replied quickly. "The paramedics are bringing him in now. They said he's lost a lot of blood. It's going to be touch and go." Jonathan nodded, his focus sharpening. This was what he was trained for. This was where he thrived, right on the edge, where every second mattered. The doors to the ER burst open and the paramedics wheeled in the gurney, the patient barely hanging on. Blood soaked the sheets, and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was erratic, indicating just how close to death the patient was. Jonathan moved toward the gurney, his hands steady as he assessed the situation. The paramedics rattled off the details: gunshot wound to the upper chest, massive blood loss, possible damage to the heart. The odds were against the patient, but Jonathan had been in this position before. He knew how to fight against the odds. "We need to get him stabilized," Jonathan said, his voice firm. "Prep the OR." As the team moved to transfer the patient to the operating room, Jonathan glanced down at the man on the gurney for the first time, and his breath caught in his throat. It was him. The officer. The man who had thrown him against his car, handcuffed him, humiliated him. Officer Michael Ransom. For a moment, Jonathan froze, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. The man lying before him, barely clinging to life, was the same man who had treated him like he was nothing just a few days ago. And now, here he was, bleeding out on a hospital gurney, his life in Jonathan's hands. The room around him seemed to fade, the voices of the nurses and doctors becoming distant as Jonathan's world narrowed to the man in front of him. The anger, the humiliation, the helplessness, it all came rushing back in a wave so powerful it nearly knocked the breath out of him. This was the man who had dehumanized him. The man who had treated him like a criminal for simply existing in a nice car. And now, this same man needed him. Needed Jonathan to save him. For a split second, Jonathan's mind raced with thoughts of revenge, of letting this man suffer as he had suffered. The temptation was there, deep in the recesses of his anger. But it was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it had come. Jonathan was a doctor. He had taken an oath to save lives, no matter whose they were, no matter what had been done to him. And, despite everything, he couldn't turn his back on that oath. He took a deep breath, forcing the emotions down, burying them beneath the professionalism he had cultivated over years of practice. This wasn't about what had happened between them. This was about saving a life. "Let's move," Jonathan ordered, his voice steady and authoritative. "We're running out of time." The team sprang into action, wheeling Officer Ransom toward the operating room, the chaos of the hospital filling the space around them once more. Jonathan followed, his mind laser-focused on the task ahead. The next few hours would be critical, and Jonathan knew that, regardless of what had happened between them, he would do everything in his power to save the man who had tried to break him, because that was who he was. The operating room was a whirlwind of motion, the sterile air thick with urgency as Jonathan and his team worked to stabilize Officer Michael Ransom. The harsh overhead lights illuminated the scene, blood pooling beneath the gurney, surgical tools clattering into the waiting hands of nurses, the beeping monitors offering an unsettling soundtrack to the life-or-death struggle unfolding on the table. Jonathan stood at the head of the operation, his hands moving with the steady precision that had earned him the respect of his peers. He had performed hundreds of surgeries like this before, but none had ever carried the same emotional weight as this one. None had ever forced him to confront the core of who he was and what he stood for in such an intense, personal way. Every time he glanced down at the man on the table, the memories of that day came rushing back. Officer Ransom's cold, dismissive tone, the rough way he had handled Jonathan, the condescending sneer on his face as he treated him like a criminal. Jonathan could still feel the sting of the handcuffs biting into his wrist, the weight of the officer's knee pressing him into the hard pavement. Those memories threatened to overwhelm him, but Jonathan pushed them aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about what had happened between them. This was about saving a life. Jonathan had taken an oath, and he wasn't about to let his personal feelings interfere with that. Not now. Not ever. "Scalpel," Jonathan said, his voice calm and authoritative despite the turmoil raging inside him. The nurse handed him the tool, and Jonathan made the first incision, his hands steady as he worked to repair the damage caused by the gunshot wound. Blood seeped from the wound, staining the white sheets beneath Ransom, but Jonathan's focus remained unbroken. He had to stop the bleeding. He had to stabilize the officer's vitals. He had to give this man a chance to live, no matter how undeserving he might seem in Jonathan's eyes. Hours passed in a blur of tense concentration. The team moved in perfect synchronization, each person playing their role in the delicate dance between life and death. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, but his hands remained steady, his mind locked onto the intricacies of the surgery. For a moment, the world outside the operating room ceased to exist. There was only the patient in front of him, only the blood vessels, the tissues, the organs that needed repair. Jonathan's mind shifted into autopilot, drawing on years of experience and training to guide him through the procedure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bleeding was under control. Jonathan stepped back, his hands shaking slightly from the intensity of the moment. He glanced at the heart monitor, watching as the irregular beeping slowly began to even out. Ransom's vitals were stabilizing. The surgery had been a success, but the weight on Jonathan's chest remained. The operation might have been over, but the emotional battle was still raging inside him. As the nurses began to clean up, Jonathan pulled off his blood-stained gloves and scrubbed his hands clean. His eyes flicked once more to the unconscious figure on the table. Officer Ransom, the man who had caused him so much pain, lying there, alive because of him. Jonathan stepped out of the operating room, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway doing little to chase away the darkness that clung to him. He leaned against the wall for a moment, taking deep breaths to calm the storm inside. He had done his job. He had saved a life. But the satisfaction that usually came with a successful surgery was absent, replaced instead by a hollow sense of unease. As he stood there, collecting himself, one of the nurses approached him. "Dr. Wilson," she said quietly, "the patient's family is waiting. They'd like to speak with you." Jonathan nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. Of course. It was standard procedure to inform the family of the outcome. But something about this felt different. It wasn't just any patient's family. It was Ransom's family, the family of the man who had tried to break him. With a deep breath, Jonathan made his way down the hallway, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. As he approached the waiting area, he saw them, Ransom's wife and teenage son, sitting in uncomfortable plastic chairs, their faces pale with fear and uncertainty. The boy looked up first, his eyes red from crying. His mother sat beside him, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. They both stood as Jonathan approached, their expressions a mix of hope and dread. "Doctor," Ransom's wife said, her voice trembling. Is he going to be okay?" Jonathan hesitated for a moment, the words catching in his throat. He had faced hundreds of families in this same situation, but this felt different. He knew the man lying in that hospital bed, knew him in a way that went beyond medical records and clinical detachment. He knew the hate that man harbored, the prejudice that had colored every interaction they'd had. But Jonathan was a professional. He couldn't let his personal feelings cloud his judgment now. "He's stable," Jonathan said, his voice steady. "The surgery was successful, and he's going to recover. It'll be a long process, but he's out of immediate danger." Ransom's wife let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank God," she whispered, clutching her son's hand tightly. The boy looked up at Jonathan, his face filled with the kind of raw, unfiltered gratitude that only comes from a child whose world has been on the verge of collapse. "Thank you," the boy said quietly, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for saving my dad." Jonathan's heart twisted in his chest. He hadn't done it for gratitude. He hadn't done it for thanks. He had done it because it was his job, because it was who he was. But hearing those words from Ransom's son, a child who had no idea what kind of man his father really was, made everything more complicated. "You're welcome," Jonathan said softly, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. As Ransom's family turned to leave, Jonathan remained in the hallway, his thoughts a tangled mess of conflicting emotions. He had saved a life, but the man he had saved had almost destroyed his. And yet, Jonathan had done it anyway. Not because he was obligated to, but because deep down he couldn't let himself become the kind of person who let hate dictate his actions. Hours passed, and Jonathan tried to lose himself in his work, tending to other patients, handling paperwork, and doing his best to return to some semblance of normalcy. But the image of Ransom lying on that operating table haunted him. It wasn't just that he had saved a man who had treated him like garbage. It was that he had done it without hesitation. And that scared him, because it meant that even after everything, Jonathan still believed in the possibility of redemption. As the day turned into night, Jonathan finally allowed himself a moment to rest. He found a quiet corner of the hospital, away from the noise and the chaos, and sat down, letting his mind wander. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and when he pulled it out, he saw a message from Alan. "Hell of a day, huh? Need a drink?" Jonathan considered it for a moment. The idea of unwinding with a friend sounded appealing, but he wasn't ready to face the world outside just yet. Not after everything that had happened. Instead, he typed a quick response. "Thanks, but I think I need some time alone. Let's catch up later." As Jonathan sat there, the exhaustion finally catching up to him, he heard footsteps approaching. He looked up and saw a familiar face, the last person he ever expected to see standing before him. It was Officer Ransom. The man looked different now, pale, weak, barely able to stand on his own. He leaned heavily on the crutches he had been given, his eyes dull with the weight of everything he had been through. But there was something else there, too. Something Jonathan hadn't seen before. Regret. "Dr. Wilson," Ransom said, his voice hoarse and strained. Can I talk to you for a minute?" Jonathan stared at him, his mind reeling. This was the man who had humiliated him, who had treated him like he was less than human. And now, here he was, asking for a conversation. For a moment, Jonathan wanted to turn away, to leave this man standing there in the hallway without a word. But something inside him, something deeper, something that went beyond his anger, compelled him to stay. Ransom took a step closer, his crutches creaking under his weight. I don't know how to say this, he began, his voice barely above a whisper, but I owe you an apology. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. An apology? From this man? I know what I did to you, Ransom continued, his eyes fixed on the floor. That day on the street, I was wrong. I was so wrong. And now I'm standing here because you saved my life. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and awkward. Jonathan didn't know what to say. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, it didn't feel the way he thought it would. I didn't do it for you, Jonathan said quietly, his voice steady but firm. I did it because it's my job, because that's who I am. Ransom nodded slowly, his face crumpling with guilt. I know, he whispered. I know, but that doesn't change the fact that you saved me. And His voice broke, and for the first time, Jonathan saw the man behind the badge, a man who had been broken by his own hatred, his own prejudice. I'm sorry, Ransom said, tears welling in his eyes. I'm so sorry for what I did to you. Jonathan stared at him for a long moment, the emotions swirling inside him too complex to untangle. He had spent so long holding on to the anger, the hurt. But now, standing here in front of this broken man, he realized that the only way to truly move forward was to let it go. I forgive you, Jonathan said, the words surprising even himself. But that doesn't mean I forget. What you did, it hurt me, and it hurt others like me, but I can't carry that weight anymore. Ransom nodded, his tears spilling over as he looked up at Jonathan with something that resembled hope. Thank you, Ransom whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Thank you for saving me, and thank you for this. Jonathan didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. He had made his peace with the situation, and now it was time to move on. As Ransom turned and walked away, Jonathan felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. He had faced the man who had tried to break him, and he had come out stronger on the other side. He had saved a life, yes, but more importantly, he had saved himself. The hospital corridors were quieter now, the hum of the day's activity fading as the evening took over. Jonathan remained seated in the same quiet corner where he had spoken with Officer Ransom, his mind still processing the unexpected conversation. The apology, the regret in Ransom's voice, and the tears had left Jonathan conflicted. For so long, he had carried the weight of the anger, the humiliation from that day. But now that Ransom had apologized, Jonathan felt something different. A release. He wasn't sure if the release was from Ransom's apology or from his own decision to forgive, but he felt lighter, as if the invisible chains that had been binding him since that fateful day had loosened. He had confronted his anger head-on and had made a choice. Jonathan had always believed in justice, in fairness, and in redemption, but the road to forgiveness had never been easy. Now, as he sat there, he understood something that had eluded him for days. Forgiveness wasn't about letting Ransom off the hook. It was about freeing himself from the burden of hatred and pain. But despite his personal resolution, Jonathan knew that Ransom still had consequences to face. The law, the system that Ransom had represented, had been used to oppress and harm. The racial biases that had led to the altercation between them were not going to disappear because of a single apology. This was bigger than just him and Ransom. There were others, like Jonathan, who had faced the same kind of abuse, and they too deserved justice. As Jonathan stood up to leave the hospital, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from his lawyer, a reminder about the case that had been building ever since the day of his unlawful arrest. Jonathan had filed a complaint against the police department after the incident, seeking legal action not just for himself, but to expose the deep-seated prejudice within the system. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Jonathan took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The conversation with Ransom had given him some peace, but it hadn't changed the fact that what had happened to him, and to countless others, was part of a much larger problem. He needed to see this through. The next day, Jonathan found himself back in the office of his lawyer, Lisa Patel. Lisa was sharp, relentless, and had been one of the few people who truly understood what Jonathan had gone through. She had taken on his case with the determination of someone who knew the stakes were higher than just one man's experience. "You ready for this?" Lisa asked, looking up from her desk as Jonathan entered. Jonathan nodded, sitting down across from her. "I am." Lisa pushed a stack of papers toward him, the legal documents that outlined their case against the police department. "We've gathered enough evidence from witnesses and the video footage. It's clear that what Officer Ransom did was unlawful. The department's racial bias policies are flimsy at best, and this incident is going to bring a lot of things to light. You're doing the right thing." Jonathan looked at the documents, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. "I know it's the right thing," he said quietly. "It's just complicated." Lisa's expression softened. "I get it. You saved the guy's life. That's gotta mess with your head." Jonathan nodded slowly. "It does. But this isn't just about him. It's about the system that allows this kind of thing to happen over and over again. If I don't fight for change, nothing will get better." Lisa leaned back in her chair, her eyes studying him. "You're one of the strongest clients I've ever had, Jonathan. What you're doing takes guts. Most people would have let this go, but you're pushing for something bigger. That takes real strength." Jonathan didn't feel particularly strong. He felt tired, emotionally drained from everything that had happened. But he knew that this fight was necessary. It wasn't just for him. It was for every person who had been wrongly profiled, humiliated, or mistreated by those in power. "I just want things to be different," Jonathan said. "I don't want the next person in my position to go through what I did." Lisa nodded, flipping through the documents. "Well, we've got a solid case. The department is going to have a hard time defending their actions, especially with the video footage we have. This is going to get attention, Jonathan, and I don't just mean in the courtroom. The press is going to be all over this." Jonathan had expected as much. Ever since the video of his arrest had surfaced online, people had been talking about it. There had been a wave of outrage, particularly from the black community, but there had also been a disturbing amount of people defending the officer's actions, claiming that Jonathan must have done something to provoke the arrest. The polarizing responses were a stark reminder of how divided the country was when it came to issues of race and policing. But Jonathan couldn't let that deter him. He had come too far to back down now. "Let them talk," Jonathan said. "The more attention this gets, the more people will understand how deep this problem runs." Lisa smiled. "That's the spirit. I'll keep you updated as we move forward. This is going to be a long battle, but I'm confident we can win." Jonathan left her office feeling a renewed sense of determination. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready for it. He had faced worse and come out stronger. Now it was time to use his strength to fight for justice, not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been silenced by the system. Weeks passed, and the case moved forward. The media picked up the story, and soon Jonathan's name became a rallying cry for those fighting against police brutality and racial profiling. His face appeared in news articles and television segments, his story resonating with those who had faced similar injustices. Jonathan hadn't set out to become a public figure, but his fight for justice had made him one. One afternoon, as Jonathan was preparing for yet another surgery, he received a visitor. It was Officer Ransom. Jonathan hadn't seen him since their conversation in the hospital, and the sight of him standing in the doorway brought a flood of emotions back. Ransom looked different now, more fragile, more human. His uniform was gone, replaced by casual clothes that made him seem smaller, less imposing. He held a file in his hand, and his expression was a mixture of guilt and determination. "Dr. Wilson," Ransom said quietly, I wanted to give you this." He handed Jonathan the file, his hands trembling slightly. Jonathan took it, opening it to find a signed statement from Ransom, detailing the events of the day he had arrested Jonathan and admitting to his misconduct. "I'm resigning from the force," Ransom said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve to wear that badge anymore. I've hurt too many people. But I'm going to do what I can to make it right. I'm going to testify in your case. I'll tell the truth about what happened." Jonathan looked at the statement, then back at Ransom. He hadn't expected this, not after everything that had happened, but here it was, the final piece of the puzzle. Ransom was facing the consequences of his actions, not just because of Jonathan's case, but because he had finally come to terms with who he had been and what he had done. "Thank you," Jonathan said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I appreciate this." Ransom nodded, his eyes downcast. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, "but I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I don't want to be that person anymore." Jonathan didn't say anything for a moment, letting the weight of Ransom's words settle. Change was possible, he knew that, but it wasn't easy, and while Ransom's actions couldn't erase what had happened, they were a step in the right direction. "I believe in second chances," Jonathan finally said, "but they have to be earned. Keep working on it." Ransom nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and something close to relief. He turned to leave, but before he walked out the door, he looked back at Jonathan. "You're a good man, Dr. Wilson," Ransom said. "A better man than I'll ever be." With that, he left, leaving Jonathan standing there with the signed statement in his hands. It was a small victory in a much larger battle, but it was a victory nonetheless. The case went to trial a few months later, and with Ransom's testimony, Jonathan's case against the police department was strong. The jury ruled in his favor, and the department was held accountable for their actions. Policies were reformed, and the case became a catalyst for change within the community. But for Jonathan, the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the fact that he had faced his demons, had stood up for what was right, and had emerged stronger. He had restored justice, not just for himself, but for others like him. And in the end, that was what mattered most. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our next videos. We have many more powerful and emotional stories coming your way. And don't forget to check out our other videos. There are even more unexpected twists and life-changing moments waiting for you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what you would do in this situation. See you in the next video.